people don't understand oftentimes that, whether it's the law or, just whether it's organizing in general, that we need to start thinking about our safety and the way that we organize as collective safety and collective solidarity. And that's really key, particularly when it comes to the law.
This is Defender Radio. I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers, brought to you by the Fur Bearers. Protest and activism are a cornerstone of change, particularly in social issues. While our right to protest and speak are guaranteed by law in both Canada and the United States, some law enforcement agencies push back at those participating in protest or activism, at times beyond their rights. Understanding what your rights are is important for all advocates, but especially for those who hit the pavement as part of their advocacy. From knowing how to keep yourself and those around you safe to what to say when things go wrong, there's a lot to learn. And to help get started on the path of learning, Bina Ahmad, a public defender with the Legal Aid Society in Manhattan, New York, joined Defender Radio to discuss activists' rights, how to interact with law enforcement, and when it's time to call a lawyer. We had met at this Anti-Fur Society conference in New York City, which was an amazing trip for me. It was my first time in the city, and I absolutely loved it there.
Oh, first time?
Yeah,
okay.
It was my first time in New York.
Oh,
and and your presentation was really good. What I liked about it is you made it very practical. This was not sort of high-level legalese stuff, but very literally the things people need to know to keep themselves and others safe. And you started by talking about the importance of individual activists or advocates or protesters recognizing that they have a role in other people's safety at events, whatever the event may be. And I thought maybe we could start there, just talking a little bit about sort of why it matters that we understand what our rights are, and also that we can create problems where problems don't exist by not knowing the rights and the laws.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you so much for your kind words and for having me and doing the podcast that you do. I think it's incredibly important. And I'd like to really always start with that, with what we're starting with about, people ask me to do these Know Your Rights trainings and talk about the law and bring my legal expertise about the criminal system to activists and teach them what they need to know about, well, what do I do when I get arrested? And I think, and that's a great, question to ask and thing to know, but I think that we always need to start with how we're engaging in politics and in movement work and what we bring to the table, way before we even start to protest or start to organize and start to engage in this process and in these movements, because people don't understand oftentimes that whether it's the law or, just whether it's organizing in general, that we need to start thinking about our safety and the way that we organize as collective safety and collective solidarity. And that's really key, particularly when it comes to the law. And I think that that's probably a universal concept in that, the law is really, I think, an oppressive tool. And I say this as a lawyer, and I didn't go to law school because I loved the law or wanted to be a lawyer. I went to law school because I saw the law as an oppressive tool, historically as an oppressive tool, particularly used to target, people of color, people from the global South, LGBTQ folks, and people from our communities, not undocumented folks, or people who are not particularly U.S. citizens, people who are of different abilities. And so I wanted to understand that and to fight it and to change that. And so, that's the framework of the law, and particularly in U.S. context. So we have to understand that our collective safety and collective solidarity, that concept and understanding that we have to protect each other and center the most vulnerable and the most targeted and the most historically targeted in our organizing. If we do that and we start from that point of view, that is what is going to keep us the most safe. So for instance, many times we have, many well-meaning white solidarity activists take our, most privileged activists, we can say, is our, a U.S. citizen, a U.S. born citizen, a white cisgendered male activist, heteronormative, gender conforming, coming into activist work, really well-meaning and wanting to do this work, but, can oftentimes come in thinking, well, I have nothing to hide. I'm I know the law, I know my rights, and I'm going to come and engage in this work. And so going to a protest, I can do whatever, do what I want. Even if I get arrested, whatever, that's okay. I'll take that risk if I want to, but that's my arrest and my, rights or whatever, my freedom that I'll choose to compromise or not. What they don't understand is that when they come and then engage in this, let's say they come and engage in more provocative, actions that maybe the group had not consented to, they can engage in certain risks and take certain risks that others in the group cannot. And the law and officers particularly will look at the entire group, and they will target more heavily people of color, undocumented folks, than they will that white cisgendered male activist. And so they might even arrest just everyone around them, for instance, and the people who will pay a heavier price for that white cisgendered male activist is the person who maybe didn't even choose to take on the risk that male activist did. And then, of course, once you're arrested, it's not just that you're put through the system, but particularly for movements and then folks who are historically targeted, it's, the legal systems that we have, of course, historically have looked into movement work, have looked into our politics, have tried to and have successfully spied on, monitored our movements, have sent infiltrators and informants into our movements, have really wanted to break apart and come into our movement work and spy on our movements. And they do that, first by, or one of the ways they do that is through an arrest, where then they can at least get access to someone, they can get access to your phone. If they have really heavy charges they can levy against someone, they can use that as leverage to force people to become informants. And so people need to understand that their individual safety is only one part of the puzzle, and that collective safety and collective solidarity is where we need to be focused. That is what keeps us the safest and the strongest. So I hope that gets sort of the framework of where I'm coming from a little clearer.
Absolutely. And that's something when we talk about intersectional activism, whatever our core issue is, that's one of the reasons it's so important to talk about that, is to understand the historical context in which some of this is happening as well. And as you mentioned, I grew up as a Canadian citizen in the suburbs of a Canadian city as a cisgender, white, heteronormative man, gender conforming, et cetera. And it's jarring when you first learn about a lot of this stuff. And I'm very, very glad there are people like you who are willing to take the time to explain it to people like me, because it really opens up the conversation about all human rights, about all issues of feminism or veganism or LGBTQ rights, whatever subject we're talking about. When we can start to see those parallels in the historical context, it really matters. And informs how we address a lot of issues as well.
Right. Well, and also want to say, throwing that back to you, it's also thank you for being an example of how you receive that information, right? And being open and talking about your privilege, and then saying, I'm grateful to hear this and to learn from folks and to be a part of this movement in a way that is supportive, right? And understanding privilege, but then we're talking about collective safety and collective solidarity. And you want to come to the table with the best politics. So you're a wonderful example of that. So thank you for that.
And as a cisgender, white, straight man, I will accept your praise. But we're going to get into a cycle if we keep doing this.
Okay. We'll just have a 2-hour-long podcast. That's fine with me. Okay.
I love the way that you cook pancakes, by the way. We can just move into that next. Anyway, so talking about this, the next thing is when we're at an event. And again, this comes from whether we are, in the street with a sign, or we are, at a sit-in, or even at a coffee shop listening to a speaker, understanding our rights, understanding the process as well, I think is very important. And I grew up watching police procedurals, and I worked as a journalist covering crime for a long time. So a lot of it was familiar to me, but hearing the flip side of it, of how to protect yourself and others, was very interesting. So why don't we go through that process of, I think the way you had sort of organized it was talking about, asking the question, am I being held? Am I being questioned, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe sort of from when law enforcement approaches on.
Yes, I would love to do that. So, so when law enforcement, and we could start from sort of a linear, we'll do it from a linear timeline. And I always say that as a caveat, because of course it can come at you from any which way. Law enforcement can come and approach you and sort of skip through this timeline. But for the purposes of teaching people sort of how to invoke your rights at different stages of these interactions, I'm going to, and I usually teach it from, we'll start with if they, law enforcement approach you on the street and they stop you and they try to speak to you and question you. That's first a conversation stage. And we'll talk about what you should say at that stage. And then, if they then hold you longer and then they try to question you longer, they try to pat you down or whatnot, that's the detention stage or the extended detention and search stage. And we'll talk about what you do there and what rights you invoke there, what you say. And then, we'll go through if they actually full-blown arrest you, put cuffs on you and try to, put you in a squad car and what you say there and what you should do from there. And so, and then I say that, of course that makes like logical linear sense, but oftentimes it can, in many of my clients' cases, police officers will skip over the conversation stage. They'll just run up to a client and throw them against the wall and start to search them with no conversation. So I say that people just need to adapt, to whatever law enforcement will throw at you. And it also is that there are things that people need to understand. There are things that law enforcement, of course, on the books are, should and should not do. And then there's a reality of what they do. So, of course, they're not supposed to do certain things like violate your rights and just come up and start questioning you about your politics or whatnot. But then, of course, we know that they violate people's rights all the time. So, all of this is it's not meant to be bulletproof. It's not going to stop necessarily any illegal actions by law enforcement. It may not completely stop you from being arrested, but it's meant to minimize the harm and to keep you the most safe and keep, of course, as we keep saying, collective safety, collective solidarity, keep you and your communities and your organizations and your movements the most safe. So, so with that, we'll start with, let's say law enforcement comes up and they stop you on the street. This is the conversation stage. Usually they may start with just, excuse me, I need to talk to you. Can I quickly, stop and ask you a question? So what we recommend is that you can answer basic, non-incriminating information. If they ask you, what's your name? Where are you going? You can answer that, and that you likely just should answer that, but answer it in very short answers. So keep it to 5 words or less. So the 5-finger rule, because you don't want to just start talking because you're nervous, which many people do. It's totally normal and understandable. But keep it to 5 words or less, answering basic, non-incriminating questions. So if the question is, excuse me, can I talk to you? You can say yes. What's your name? My name's Bina. So that was 3 words. Then the next question could be, where are you going? Or where are you coming from? Or I'm going home, or coming from work. Right. So those are very basic, non-incriminating, questions and answers. I didn't say anything more specific. I didn't go on and on. I didn't say I'm coming from work. I work at the Legal Aid Society in Manhattan, New York. The address is, I didn't go on and on. I didn't give too much information, but I answered this basic questions. So then at that point, that, conversation phase, I've answered, very basic questions they've asked me. Now, what you need to do there is then you need to say the first set of magic words to try to end this conversation phase, or to try to end the police encounter. And why I say that you need to, you meaning the person who's being stopped, say these magic words is because police will not usually just tell you, that you're free to go on their own. And they, of course, are not to be trusted to tell you what your rights are. Many people will ask the police, like, do I have to answer these questions, or do you have the right to do this? And it's really important for people to understand you can't look to the police to tell you what your rights are. You need to know them, and they're not your lawyers. So after you answer those basic questions about your name, maybe where you're going, you need to immediately say on your own, am I free to leave? Am I free to leave? Those are the first set of magic words. And now once you ask that question, those first set of magic words, police will either say, okay, yes, you're free to leave. Then the encounter is done and you can walk away, slowly and calmly, and then you're done. But for our purposes, we're going to assume that they say, no, you're not free to leave. So now the encounter has escalated up one step to the detention phase. So you have asked them if you are free to leave and they have said no. So now the very next question you ask them after that is the next set of magic words, because you want to actually check, okay, so now we were just in this conversation stage of the encounter. Now it sounds like I'm in the detention phase. So you want to check, are you detaining me? That's the next set of magic words. Are you detaining me? Because you want to see if you are actually now being detained. So for our purposes, just for education, it would make logical sense that they would say yes, because if you weren't free to leave, it would make sense now that you are being detained. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they might try to mess with you and say no, which wouldn't really make logical sense. So if they say no, you're not being detained, then just go back down one step in the encounter, back to the conversation phase and say, okay, so then am I free to leave? You don't want to just start walking away. You don't want to escalate the encounter in any way. You just want to remain calm and just stick to those magic words. But for our purposes, we're going to assume that, if you weren't free to leave and then you ask, are you detaining me? They're going to likely say yes. So you can ask why. Why are you detaining me, or just why? They may or may not give you an answer. They may not, tell you the truth, but that you do have the power to ask that question if you'd like to. Now, at this point, you want to then say the next set of magic words, which is, I wish to remain silent. I wish to remain silent. Now, this is very key in the sense that the point of majority of temporary detentions on the street is to get more information. Usually either they're doing an investigation on the street or they might have already been monitoring you for a while now, and they've now been following you either from work or from home, and they're trying to talk to you and crack you and get you to give them information about who knows what. So you want to clue them into the fact that, okay, fine, you cannot fight them. You obviously know you're being detained, but this detention is pointless. They are not getting information from you. You're going to remain silent. I'm not saying anything. Fine, we can stand here for however long on the street and I'll just stare at you and I'm going to remain silent. So you want to clue them in that they can do, they have the power, not the right. People have rights, police have power, but they have the power to detain you, but it's going to be meaningless. You're going to remain silent. So I wish to remain silent. And this is also very key for people to remember that the point also of remaining silent, not answering these, more probing questions like who do you organize with? What are your politics? Because they can seem like innocent questions. There's nothing, that sounds like, let's say, for instance, you say, oh, I organize with, whatever animal rights group. Who do you organize with? I organize with this person. But, they're really great. They're very, peaceful. They abide by all the laws. They do this work. That information might sound innocent enough. And it might actually sound like you're standing up for your friend and saying that your friend is law abiding and, not someone that the police need to be worried about. But what you're doing is you're giving them information you don't need to be giving them. And what's important to understand is you don't know what police are investigating. You don't actually know what they already know. You have no idea if they are stopping you on the street just randomly or if they've been monitoring you for a while. You also don't know if they're investigating you or your friend. They might be stopping you to actually get information about your friend or your organization. And so, this goes to the principle of minimizing our contact with law enforcement. All of this is focused around the collective safety, collective solidarity, and minimizing contact with law enforcement. It will never help us to give more information to law enforcement than they already have, because as we know in the digital age, they probably have a lot of information on all of us already. It's not going to help us to engage more with law enforcement. It's not going to help you to try to talk your way out of a detention or an arrest. It's not going to help your community to give them even what seems like innocuous or innocent information on your friend, because you have no idea what laws are on the books. You have no idea how many different crimes and criminal statutes are on the books, how you could be violating them. You have no idea what they're investigating. So the best principle is to minimize contact and remain silent. So at this phase, we've now said, okay, I wish to remain silent. Now, this is where we want to try to slow things down in our brain and become our own observers. Try to, if you can. And it's hard because it's terrifying to be stopped by police. They are armed to the teeth with military-grade weapons. They're usually much larger than the majority of people. They're trained to interrogate people. They're trained to intimidate people. And so it's naturally terrifying. But it's very important for people to try to slow things down in your mind, take some breaths, and look around you. See, one, just how many officers are there. There might be one who's talking to you. There might be one more in the background watching. If you can see their badge numbers or their names, try to remember that. If you're on a street corner and maybe you're in front of a deli or, a store, or there's other people around, try to see who you're in front of. If it's a neighbor, if it's a deli where there's, a surveillance camera outside. These are all things that could be useful information for your defense attorney if you are arrested later, or just an attorney if you want to sue later if you're not arrested, and just try to become your own observer. Now, at this point where we've now said we've passed the conversation phase, we are now in the detention phase, we've said we wish to remain silent, this is often where a pat down can come in. So, in the U.S., it's called a Terry frisk. It's based on a Supreme Court case. Now, a frisk on the street is meant to be for the officer's safety, which is, somewhat laughable because they are armed with military-grade weapons, but it's for their safety. That when they are stopping someone, they have the power, not the right, but the power to pat you down to see if you have weapons on you. So they're supposed to just be allowed to pat your outer clothing down to see if you have what feels like a hard metal object that could be a weapon. Mm-hmm. And so then if it feels like you do, then they could then go into your pocket and take it out. They shouldn't be going into your pocket if it feels like there's something soft or squishy, like a dime bag or anything in your pocket. But, they could, of course, that doesn't mean they're not going to violate your rights, but that's what the pat down is for. So if that starts to happen, one, police may not actually ask your permission. They may just start to pat you down, or they may just say, put your arms out and spread your legs. I'm going to, pat you down. Or they may actually ask to say, okay, is it okay if I pat you down, or I'm going to pat you down now? Whatever way this happens, what we recommend people do is not to physically fight them, not to resist, not to stiffen your body or try to move away, because that can quickly escalate to violence on you, and you want to stay safe. So we recommend people physically comply. If you have to put your arms out, or whatnot, do what they physically tell you to do. But at the same time, you now say the next set of magic words, which is, I do not consent to this search. I do not consent to this search. And that protects your rights against, or challenging this search later in court. You're deeming that, I don't legally consent to this search. I'm not physically fighting you, but I'm not waiving my rights to challenge this search. Because in the U.S., it is deemed that you consent to that search if you, say, sure, you can pat me down, or even if you just stay silent. Silence is consent. So if you're just quiet, also probably because you're terrified, that is consent. So you really have to reach in and find that voice of yours, and even if it's shaky, and just say, I don't consent to this search. Try to say it as loud as possible in case there are people who may be cop watching and filming the encounter, and they can record that. And I can talk about cop watching in a minute as well. So after this happens, at this point, logically, then the next step could be the arrest. So this is where police, they may tell you you're under arrest. They may not. They may just slap cuffs on you. And this is where then, in the U.S., they should, and they, again, may or may not read you what's called your Miranda rights. So your Miranda rights are, of course, based on a Supreme Court case that the police are supposed to read you what your rights are once you're arrested. And those rights are that you have the right to remain silent, and that anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. So it is imperative that whether police read you those rights or not, that people understand that those rights apply to you the minute you are arrested. So whether they read you those rights or not, it is extremely important to, people forget everything else that I tell them. I always say the most important thing for people to do is once you're arrested, the minute those cuffs go on, you should immediately say, I'm not talking without my lawyer. Mm-hmm. I'm not talking without my lawyer. That's the last set of magic words. And then you have to stay silent. So it's very important that you don't say, I'm not talking without my lawyer, but I'm going to just tell you one thing about this case, or whatever happened. Because then you've now started talking, and now they can talk to you back, and it's not deemed to be a violation of your rights. And, not talking means, giving statements about, your case, or into talking in an interrogation context. You should, of course, if they bring you to the precinct and ask you biographical booking questions like your name, address, phone number, that you should give. That's not deemed like waiving your rights to remain silent. But of course, don't answer questions about okay, what did you do, or tell me about this group you organized with. Again, just keep repeating, I'm not talking without my lawyer. Because of course, police, they shouldn't try to question you after you say that, but they still may, and just keep repeating that I'm not talking without my lawyer. So those are the basic overarching, things you should say. So just quickly summarizing, when you're stopped in the street, am I free to leave? If they say no, you say, are you detaining me? If they say yes, you say, okay, I wish to remain silent. You can ask, and then at that point, a stop and frisk, a pat-down might happen. You should say, I do not consent to this search while you physically still comply. And then after that, if they arrest you, you should say, I'm not talking without my lawyer. And those are the sort of main magic words and, invoking of rights that people should remember when they're encountering police on the street.
Now, something that I learned from Law and Order, which means it's totally true.
Totally. Absolutely.
That's how TV works. Are police officers allowed to lie to someone to try and entice them to speak?
Yes.
Or to try and convince them to speak?
Yes, absolutely. That is extremely key. And I'm very glad you asked that. Police are absolutely allowed to stretch the truth, quote, stretch the truth, fabricate. They're basically allowed to lie to people to get them to talk. So it is that it's scary that, yes, Law and Order, I mean, there's many things about it that are completely, laughable. I don't even watch the show because I'm sure I would just have, I would get heartburn at the end of it. But there's many things about legal shows where yes, it's totally true, where you see that stereotypical, cop coming into an interrogation room and slamming a file down and saying, hey, your friends have already confessed and said that you did it. And I see that you're a nice guy, and, but if you, tell me what happened and you write out an apology, I will tell the judge to go easy on you. You'll probably just get a ticket, or you have to pay a fine, and they'll let you go. And then there's a nice cop behind them and saying, he's just in a bad mood, but if you just go along with it, it'll be fine. That absolutely happens. And that happens every day. The good cop, bad cop routine absolutely happens. They are legally allowed to lie to you, to get you to talk, to get information from you. It's an interrogation tactic. And it is not deemed to be a violation of your rights. It's deemed to be a police, method of interrogation and investigation. It's atrocious. It's something people need to understand. That's part of the, thing I tell people, that you can't look to police to tell you what your rights are. Mm-hmm. Many times people will say, well, I asked the cop, do I have to answer these questions, or, or what my rights are? Can I do this, or can they do that? And they're not your lawyer, right? Their job is to make arrests and to, give then these arrests to the prosecutor to then prosecute. And so, your lawyer is your defense attorney. And so you don't get access to your defense attorney until later, but they are absolutely allowed to lie to you to get you to talk.
And you had mentioned cop watching, and this is something that's becoming more and more and more important, and I think will remain important until we see body cams on every officer all the time. And arguably even then we'll still need it. And I think we saw, and I'm sure you would have seen this viral video that came out last week of a woman who was watching and went over and started recording a young man, a homeless man, being told to get on the ground with guns pointed at him by police.
I don't know if I saw that video.
Oh, it's an intense one. It's a young black man, and a woman went over, and a black woman went over to him and stood with him, recording, and sort of told him, okay, your life isn't worth this. Just do what they're telling you to do. And he's saying, I didn't do anything. She's like, I believe you, but your life isn't worth this. They're killing us. Just do what they're telling you to do, and stayed with them. And it's just it's a very, how bad could that have gone had she not been there? But
right.
So
right.
Let's talk cop
Yeah.
watching.
Yes.
What is it? Why is it important? And why is it legal?
Yes. So, yes, you absolutely have the right to film police activity that's happening in public. You of course can't go into, police precincts in the back into their offices, and film when they're doing a private investigation, with their colleagues. But when it's on the street or they're, coming into your home and searching your home, you have the right to film police activity. So, and I, recommend that if it is safe for you to do so, you absolutely should. And so this is, again, where collective safety and collective solidarity, that theme constantly comes up. So, for my, well-meaning, white solidarity, male, heteronormative, cisgendered activists, it is much safer for them to do cop watching, and they get much less pushback from the cops, than from folks who are historically targeted and marginalized in our society. That's not to say that folks of all backgrounds and identities don't and should, if they feel comfortable, cop watch. But that is just one role where people can step up if they are of the more privileged background and they can do cop watching. So cop watching is the filming of police activity, and so it's very the encounter you described seeing is one of the very typical and common ways that people cop watch, where they see police stopping someone on the street or in their car, and they might see it and they stop and they film it. Now, there's cop watching where there are actually formal teams who actually train each other to cop watch, and they go out wearing sweatshirts or t-shirts that say cop watch, and they actually go out in teams into neighborhoods that are overly policed, looking for police encounters to then film, to monitor and to document police activity. So they'll actually go out and look and try to help or monitor these police encounters. So cop watching is, on the most bare sense, it is filming police activity, but on the political sense, it is to try to not only hold police, of course, accountable, but it can save someone's life. It can, when police see that someone is filming, they can often, and of course not always, and I see this thinking of Eric Garner, and that they knew they were being filmed and they still killed him on video. But it can often save someone's life, where if police know they're being filmed and watched, that they sometimes will actually then be somewhat less harsh with the person that they're stopping or arresting, or just be even maybe not as aggressive, and then either walk away from just harassing the person that they're the homeless person. They might just be telling them keep it moving or whatnot. So that is where the political nature of cop watching can come in. And again, it's very important to, if you're filming and you're cop watching, to do it safely and from a safe distance, not only for yourself, because you as a cop watcher can end up getting arrested if you physically get in the way. Like if you're too close and you're physically getting actually between the officer and the person they're either arresting or stopping and frisking or questioning, that can be obstructing government administration, which is a criminal statute in New York, and there's similar ones throughout the country. So you're getting in the way of an officer's duties. So you could actually then be arrested yourself. Of course, if you physically touch an officer, that could, you actually might even slightly injure them. That can be felony level assault. So you could then be injured. Then, they will likely roughly arrest you, and they will probably destroy your camera. So then it sort of defeats, not only it gets you arrested, it defeats the purpose of cop watching, because now you don't have your footage. But it's also important to do it safely and not, be provoking the officers in the sense where you're swearing at them and getting, really angry and like provoking them, as much as it's understandable, be like, you effing pigs and blah, blah, blah. And because that can also get them really riled up, and they'll take out their aggression on the person that you're trying to help, who you're cop watching. The person they're arresting, it may not really help them if you're pissing off the cops that who are already cuffing that person and they have their knee in their back. Not really going to help the person, if you're pissing off those cops even more. So, and then, third, it's not going to really help. And again, I know that the criminal system is, I don't think it's a system of justice whatsoever. But keeping in mind that that it doesn't necessarily help if this case needs to go to trial. If I, as the defense attorney, need to use that footage, for this person's trial, it doesn't help me. If the footage is shaky, first of all, if you're not calmly standing there filming it, but you're, interfering, you're physically jumping around, and you're also swearing and calling the cops pigs and whatnot, doesn't necessarily help me in front of a judge or a jury if that's my quote unquote credible video. Like I'm trying to make it, it would be much more helpful if the video is calm and quiet and just observing versus shaky and the person filming is like swearing and screaming. It doesn't lend credibility to our side as much in the court. Not saying that in the sort of realm of the world, but in the court.
When we're talking about a lot of this stuff, like in the back of my mind, I think of the lawyers I know personally and professionally through work primarily. Like I've often contacted Camille Labchuk of Animal Justice. I've spoken with a couple of attorneys from Animal Legal Defense Fund. And then there's the attorneys that we work with through the Fur Bears. So I kind of like, if something comes up, I feel confident that I have people I can reach out to.
Yeah.
Whether it is in my role as a writer and content producer needing someone to look at something and say, am I too close to the line on libel here? Or if it's, hey, I may have run down someone in my car and I can't get the blood out.
Oh,
do you have a shovel I can borrow?
Yeah,
I'm not saying I've done that.
That's hypothetical. Yep,
yes.
Don't do that. Yep. Yep.
No, but my point is I've got the range of people I can think of who to contact. For a lot of activists, though, I think particularly younger activists who don't have those relationships in place, how do they go about developing maybe a network or knowing who to contact? Is this a case where you can just, when you, like, as we discussed, saying, I'm not speaking until I talk to, or I'm only going to speak to my lawyer, and you don't have a lawyer? Do you just assume that they're going to find someone? What's the best way to sort of prepare for some of these eventualities?
Right. So, yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So when I tell people to say, I'm not talking without my lawyer. My lawyer is the theoretical sense of the lawyer or the legal counsel I am guaranteed to under the Constitution, that you will be given a lawyer, whether you have one or not. And, I think majority of people don't have sort of a lawyer on retainer, just, ready to call, who will show up at a precinct, in the middle of the night. So my lawyer is normally your public defender, your free lawyer that the court will give you once you're brought to your arraignment. So just that you are protected by your right to counsel. And until you have a lawyer that is given to you, they're not technically legally supposed to even try to talk to you again until a lawyer for you who's been given to you is present. So so you don't need to worry that like, oh, but I say my lawyer and I don't have a lawyer. That's totally fine. I think the larger question is a very good question about like, well, what do people do if they have, legal questions? What are they supposed to do and who they're supposed to call? Definitely, I put myself out as someone who's always willing to help. People can individually reach out to me. But of course, I'm only one person. That doesn't really help, for a nation of, or multi-nations of people we're trying to, get mobilized. I think that having organizations like, Animal Legal Defense Fund and the organizations that you work with are very key. I think the Know Your Rights information that's available online is also just really key for people to just study and know, because I think even having lawyers on retainer, a lot of the things are things that people wouldn't need a lawyer to necessarily call and to ask. Like, of course, if there's a criminal case, you will get a lawyer eventually. But, if you really study the Know Your Rights information that is out there and what you should do and what you should know and say if you're arrested or if you're stopped by the police, that is something you can do as just a person in the world. But the organizations that are out there that have good politics that you can call, and then they can either refer you to a lawyer. There are many different bar associations throughout the U.S. and then I'm sure also in Canada that have different criminal defense committees that you can call if you need a lawyer who can, help you with an issue, or a First Amendment lawyer or free speech lawyer, or, when you're afraid of I'm a journalist, I want to publish this, but I'm afraid I'm going to get sued for libel. Mm-hmm. I think the bar associations are really great, because I also think, especially with nonprofits, I think there are many great nonprofits out there, but I think on the flip side, many nonprofits get stuck in the nonprofit industrial complex where they're just really worried constantly about fundraising. And bar associations, aren't necessarily doing that. They get their dues just from the attorneys who pay for them when they are registered. And then the attorneys can just join the committees, and then there's committees, and then they just sort of do their work within the committee. So their main focus is not fundraising, the attorneys that are there. Their main focus is just they're practitioners in their field. And then, the Bar Association can refer you to those committees who do the work on the subject area you need help in. So I think the bar associations are really untapped resources, more so than the nonprofits. I think sometimes nonprofits, there can be either, a conflict of interest, or not necessarily as wide of an array of attorneys as we might need.
To learn more about the Legal Aid Society of New York, visit legalaidnyc.org. Bina can be found on Twitter at Bina Ahmad ESQ. That's it for now, folks. I want to thank Bina for joining me, and all of you for listening. As always, I hope you'll follow me on social media, at Defender Radio on Twitter and Facebook, and at Howie Michael on Instagram, where you can find out about upcoming episodes and interviews, regale in my horrible sense of humor, and see adorable photos of JJ the Hamilton Hound. Until next time, I'm Michael Howie for Defender Radio, reminding you to stay informed and stay strong.